There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's just before 11 a.m. on an overcast, windswept January day in 1965. And 15-year-olds Marianne and Christine hop off the train at Sydney's Cronulla Beach with 4 little kids in tow. They're Marianne's siblings, and the teenagers have promised them a day at the seaside during the school holidays. Packed up with towels, spending money, a thermos of cold lime green cordial and a bunch of sandwiches, Marmite and tomato and cucumber, the teenagers lead their little party of 6 towards the beach. When they get there, it's closed due to dangerous conditions. But it doesn't stop 8-year-old Wolfgang from having a paddle in the more sheltered southern end. Next, they decide on a walk. They hide their bags and belongings behind some rocks and set off north towards Wanda Beach. At about 1 p.m, the little kids start to complain. The wind is fierce and it keeps whipping the sand up on their legs. Marianne and Christine set them up behind some sand dunes with towels and a transistor radio and tell them they'll be back soon. It's the last time they're seen alive. What happens next remains one of Australia's most infamous unsolved murders, despite more than 14,000 interviews and 5,000 suspects. It's a case that left not just Australians shocked and appalled, but has stayed with the police officers who investigated it all these decades later. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with award-winning author Alan J Whiticker about the Wanda Beach murders. Alan's been interested in this case for decades, and in 2003 published Wanda, the untold story of the Wanda Beach murders. And just a note before you hear our conversation, while we always aim to discuss each case with sensitivity and respect, what happened to these 2 teenage girls back in 1965 was fairly graphic. This episode does contain explicit descriptions of murder and sexual assault. Alan, what drew you to writing and reporting on this story in the first place?
Having grown up in the 60s, I was very well aware of the Wanda Beach murders and the fact that they were unsolved. Also, growing up in Western Sydney, my older cousins were all surfies. Even though they lived 50 kilometres from the surf, you could catch the train from Penrith, where I lived, and get all the way to Cronulla. And they would come back and, of course, tell stories to their younger cousins and scare the daylights out of us about these unsolved murders, and 2 girls were found in the beach. And I had that memory growing up. And then when I was a young teacher in the early 20s, there were a couple of, I suppose, breakthroughs in the case. They were chasing one person in particular, and it just switched something on in me. I remember this as a kid. What was the story? And you had bits of information, but not a lot of information. And when I started writing, I started out as a sports writer covering rugby league, because that's what I knew in Western Sydney. And I had a very good publisher who said, look, I know that you do all this sports stuff, but what would you really like to write about? And I said, I'd love to write about the Wanda Beach murders. And she said, well, off you go and do it for us.
That's definitely a change of pace.
It is. It was sort of like a whiplash,
Yeah.
know. But I said to my wife, where do I start? How do you do it? This is in 2002. I was a very successful school teacher. I was acting principal at the time. And one day my wife came home from work and said, Russell Oxford says hello. And I said, who's Russell Oxford? She goes, you taught his kids at another school a couple of years ago, and his kids are now in my class. And I said, oh, yeah, Russell. I remember Russell. Well, Russell was head of the unsolved homicide. He was the leading detective in Sydney. And Karen, my wife, mentioned that I was writing a book on the Wanda Beach murders, and Russell said, I'll get Alan the files. So I had 12 volumes of original files, including the original brief of evidence given to me by New South Wales Police. And it was an incredible opportunity to not only write something that I wanted to write about, but also something factual from the actual notes.
I want to take us back to the start. So I want to start with the Schmidt family. They arrived in Australia from Germany in the late 50s. What was their story?
Well, post-war in Australia, there was an immigration boom. The country was encouraging people from Western Europe, England especially, the 10-pound poms, to come to Australia. Populate or perish. That was the government's aim in the 50s. So the Schmidt family were one of groups of thousands of, I suppose, displaced Europeans who were aiming for a new life in Australia. And Australia had all the things, I suppose, that people in Europe wanted at that time. We had space, we had opportunity, we had the bush, we had beaches, and we had employment. We had the opportunity to work. And the Schmidt family came from Germany and they arrived here in the late 50s. But pretty much from the beginning, there was a tragic series of circumstances that they came up against, leading up to the fateful day that they went to Wanda Beach.
Where does Marianne fit in all of this? She was one of many children. Yeah,
there were 7 children and Marianne was the second eldest, had an older brother. And then she had a younger sister and then 4 younger siblings, the youngest of which was born in Australia. But when they arrived in Australia in the late 50s, their father found work as a carpenter, but he developed Hodgkin's disease, which was in that time a pretty fatal blood cancer. And he passed away in 1964, the year before the children went to Wanda Beach. And the family all of a sudden, large family, they'd got immigration housing in West Ryde. They'd been shuffled around a little bit. They'd lost the head of the family. So they were a little bit in a displaced time, not knowing what the future held. And at that time in 1965, during the school holidays, their mother was actually in hospital having a major operation. So as I said before, it was a series of tragic instances, mistakes, circumstances that led them to go to the beach that day. And once again, it was something totally out of tune, not only for the 60s and the population growing up at that time, but also for that family who were, new Australians, didn't know the language very well, didn't know the culture, but, fell afoul of something that was totally out of step.
Well, I guess it's not surprising then that Marianne formed such a close friendship with her neighbour, given everything that was going on. Tell us about that friendship and about Christine.
Well, Christine Sharrock was of similar age to Marianne, both 15, lived next door, had same sort of interests, boy crazy, Elvis crazy, went to different high schools, but they also had, I suppose, a similar background in that Christine's father had passed away and Christine's mother had remarried, and Christine, having spoken to some of her friends from high school, was a very, single-minded and determined girl, and she decided that she wanted to stay with her grandparents rather than be integrated into this new family. And the Schmidt family lived next door. So this was a great opportunity for Marianne to find out about, local customs and the local lifestyle. And they formed a friendship. They looked very similar height, brown hair. They shared a lot of the same interests. And I wrote at the time that they were inseparable. They did everything together.
You mentioned earlier that Marianne's mother was in hospital, and this is when this all kind of played out. The 2 girls decided to go on a bit of a field trip with the younger Schmidt children to the beach. They're out West Sydney and they're headed towards Cronulla. Can you give us a bit of a lay of the land? Well,
they live at a place called West Ryde on Victoria Road. It's the old western suburbs, but we now call it the inner west because there wasn't much, past Parramatta in those days in the 1960s. You're really getting, to what we call the bush. So West Ryde was the inner city, and Cronulla is the only Sydney beach that's accessible by railway. So they'd learned that if they hopped on the train, got to Redfern, and then took the changing train to Cronulla, they could get straight to the beach. They couldn't get to Bondi. They couldn't get to Manly. It was just too far. But a number of times, Marianne Schmidt's father had taken them to that beach and shown them the way. And I suppose it was a beach they had a lot of fond memories. They went a couple of times during the school holidays. They went on the 2nd of January and had a great day. It was sunny. The beaches were packed. They met some young boys there, very innocent relationships. They wrote about all this in their diaries, which I got a chance to read during my investigation. And given that their mother was in hospital and the younger children were at a bit of a loss during the school holidays, they wanted to go back to the beach on the Sunday, but it was bad weather. It was raining, the seas were rough. So they held it over for another day on the 11th of January, which was a Monday. And Christine's grandmother said, look, don't go today. It's too windy. You've got the little kids with you. The older boys of the Schmidt family didn't want to go. Helmut, who was about 17 at the time, had started an apprenticeship, and he wanted to paint the kitchen while his mother was in hospital. And the second oldest brother, Hans, he wanted to stay home and mow the lawn. That was one of the little chances of fate where the older boys decided not to go as well. But the two girls were quite capable of taking the four young siblings with them. They got a thermos together and some sandwiches and packed a couple of bags, and off they went on that fateful day.
So what happened when they got to Cronulla Beach that morning?
Well, everything went wrong, really. Once they got to the beach was closed for the day. Now, even though the beach was closed, there were still about 100 people on the beach.
Because it's January we're talking about.
Yeah.
January 1965 in Australia. It's warm.
Yeah, it's supposed to be warm, but it was an overcast day. The previous day had chopped all the sea up. They could still go into the shallows and have a bit of a dip around the rock pool, but they decided to press on. They went to the bottom end of Cronulla. So Cronulla Beach, for your listeners who may not know it, it's a series of 4 beaches along a very long peninsula leading up to Kurnell, the Kurnell oil refinery, about 2 kilometres away. They could walk along the sand dunes, and they'd done this before. One of the girls had remarked, we're going to take the kids, along the sand dunes and go for a walk again. They were warned by the grandmother, don't go too far. You've got little kids with you. It was very windy that day, but, they kept to their promise. They set off at about lunchtime. They had a bit of a play down the bottom end. They put their clothing behind the rocks, and off they set, the 6 of them, up into the sand dunes. It's not there now because all the sand has been mined for all the freeways that have been built in the 50 years since. But at the time, they were big rolling sand hills that they called green hills. They were topped with little shrubs, and, it was quite a long trek towards Kurnell. But they were determined to go there, and off they set.
They reached the Wanda Beach Surf Club at about 1 p.m. And that's where they kind of parted ways with the little kids. What was that all about? Well,
the little kids were complaining that the sand was whipping their legs and it was too windy. But the girls were determined. They said, no, we're going to go. And halfway along, about 600 metres past the Wanda Surf Club, they decided to leave the younger children between 2 sand dunes covered with the towels. And they had a transistor radio with them. So they left their purses with them as well. They left their tickets to go home with them. And they said, look, we're going off for a walk and we'll be back to get you in half an hour. But they never came back. And the kids waited there for most of the afternoon, about 5 o'clock, which is a good 4-hour wait.
For 4 little kids.
For 4 little kids. They thought maybe the girls had doubled back. So they went back and got their gear from down near the rocks, caught the last train back to West Ryde at 6 p.m. And when they got home at 8 o'clock, they informed Christine's grandmother that the girls had got lost somehow. And the adults merely felt, well, maybe they've missed the last train or they went for a walk. There wasn't really alarm bells, but the local police were called and they did come that night. In those days, it was a very innocent time. There was no media alert because there was no media. TV turned off 11 o'clock. There may have been radio reports. There was no newspapers until the next day. There was certainly no social media. So it wasn't until the next day that the full horror of what happened was exposed.
Yeah, it sounds like there wasn't a lot of urgency. And Marianne's mum was in hospital too.
She was, and the oldest brother, Helmut, went and visited her and she asked, how did the kids go at the beach today? Well, they're not home yet, but when he got home and the older girls weren't with them, he was worried. And it wasn't until the next day that the mother found out that Marianne was missing and Christine was missing.
So the next day, a teenager called Peter Smith took his 3 nephews for a walk along the sandhills that we were just talking about. What did they find?
Well, they were going in and out of the sand dunes, and they were about 1 kilometre from the Wanda Beach surf house, about halfway between where the kids had been last left before they head back. 2 of the boys were running ahead and they discovered something buried in the sand. And as Peter approached, and I actually interviewed Peter, I got his phone number, and Peter Smith told me that he thought it was a mannequin, buried in the surf as a prank. And as he got closer, he could see 2 feet was sticking out from one end, and he could see the top of what appeared to be a girl's head at the end. And when he felt the forehead, he was shocked that this was real. So he ran to Wanda Surf Club and sounded the alarm then. But it wasn't until the police came and detectives came later that afternoon, they realised that it's not one body, it's two bodies.
Because they would have started to sift through the sand and reveal what was there. Well, and this is very graphic, but can you take us through what they found?
I actually got the opportunity to not only read the autopsy reports, but I've seen the crime scene photos, and it's a case when you're writing about violent crime especially that you can tend to intellectualise about it. You know, two girls were found on the beach. Okay, that's all it was. But when you see the horror of what they went through, you realise that this was a very, very violent crime. Both girls had been stabbed to death. One girl, Marianne, had her throat cut. The other girl, Christine, had her skull fractured. And what police believe happened was that they were either confronted by somebody or they had agreed to meet somebody in that area north of where they left the children. And somehow during the course of events, Marianne had been stabbed. Christine had run for her life. The person responsible had chased after her, bludgeoned her with a steel pipe or something heavy, and then dragged her 100 feet. Now, 100 feet.
It's a long way.
It's a long way. So he chased her a fair way. And even with, you know, the potential screaming or the sound, the fact that it was an isolated area, you know, nobody came to their rescue. The girls had been attempted to be raped, and they were buried beside each other in the dunes. It was only really a passing attempt to bury them. They were really just covered with sand. And during the course of the night and the windy day, of course, they had been partially revealed. But when they excavated the whole area, they realised that this was just such a violent crime. And the one thing I got from reading the news reports from the 1960s, this was a sensational crime. You know, if this crime was to happen today, it would be, you know, one of the biggest crimes obviously in Australia, and social media would be going into overdrive. But at that time, it was just so out of step with the innocence of the time. The fact that, you know, a group of kids could go to the beach and, you know, wind up buried in the sand with their throats cut was just totally foreign to the way Australia lived. It really shook up a lot of the detectives, many of whom I got the chance to interview. And even though there was an earnest investigation, you know, they did nothing wrong. They were just so overpowered by the enormity of this that they were really just suffocated in case notes, and they suffocated in erroneous reports. They were distracted by too many theories. They didn't make too many mistakes, but they didn't have the breakthrough and that one piece of luck that they need, especially in the first 40 hours. What you hear on TV is very true. Those first couple of days are crucial to solving any case. No member of the public came forward with that bit of information that could piece it together.
You said that the police, and I can imagine, coming across a scene like that would have been absolutely horrified. But were those details shared with the public at the time, or you said that the public couldn't really kind of respond to it?
No, probably not until the coronial inquest 2 years later were the full details revealed. I think police wanted to keep a lot of things close to their chests. And, of course, you had a number of people who were mentally disturbed and they volunteered that they were involved and they did it. And as soon as they questioned them, you know, where did you bury the children? Well, I buried them 6 foot under. And, well, they knew that that was wrong and they were able to use that. But I suppose the idea that someone could just come across these two girls and kill them and get away with it, and no family member or member of the public could identify who they were, that was the bit of luck that was missing from this case. And then I think the other thing that not so much derailed the investigation but snowed it under in a lot of reports was the appearance of the surfer, the 16-year-old boy, and that never came up for a couple of days. That was an added bit of information that one of the boys, Wolfgang Schmidt, came up and said, look, I actually saw the girls with a boy. And that's when the 16-year-old surfy, the bronzed Aussie, became the chief suspect. Unfortunately, there were 10,000
surfy
surfing
boys.
Yeah, in that time. And it was very hard for police to sift through the mountain of information that came through.
Also, they were relying on evidence from an 8-year-old.
And that was very tough because he was a young boy who had only a passing command of the language. And when police interviewed him in the presence of his older brother, his story would change a little bit. Yes, he saw the boy. Then the next day it was, I saw the boy a week before when we were at the beach. So then the idea that, well, did they arrange to meet with this boy on the 11th? Was that why they were so keen to go up into the sand hills? Then on the third day, I think Wolfgang said that he had a knife on his hip. So now they didn't know whether he was making this up or whether he was using his imagination. But nobody else saw the boy with the girls in the sandhills, although a couple of the other boys and the other sister Trixie said that there was a boy crabbing among the rocks on that day. So there was a lot of unknowns. There was a lot of, I suppose, information that the police couldn't sift together. And the other thing that really, I think, sunk the investigation was in those days there was no cross-checking of information. Everything was written on what was called a running sheet. So you had single pieces of paper. If somebody rang up and said, look, my husband was away that day, he came home late, he was covered in blood, they had to type that up. And there was no way of matching that with another description. There was no computerization. There was no index card sifting. And what they ended up with within 3 or 4 days was, 10,000 bits of separate information that they couldn't sift through. The other thing that happened was, because of the time, every wife that had a grudge about a husband who was, an alcoholic or someone who abused, they dobbed them in as well. Any sibling who matched that description was dobbed in. Any neighbour kid that was a pest was dobbed in. And they were just snowed under, unfortunately.
The other kind of evidence I wanted to touch on before we moved on was alcohol being in one of the girls' systems.
Yeah. Look, when they did the autopsy on the 2 girls, they found a number of things. They found that Christine had her skull fractured. They found out that both girls had attempted to be raped, but they hadn't been. They also found a sperm sample on one of the girls' pants, which they put to one side. But they also, when they checked the contents of her stomach, they found decaying vegetable matter, such as a Chico roll.
Yep.
And they also found that she had a blood alcohol content of about 0.015, which is about 10 ounces or a middy of beer. Now, these were 15-year-old girls. Even though they had money, the money hadn't been spent. They hadn't chuffed off to a local cafe. Where would they get alcohol from? The pathologist said no, it wouldn't be the fermenting vegetable matter in the stomach. She would have had to have taken the alcohol via the mouth. So, a new scenario came up. Did they meet someone in the hills? Had they arranged to meet someone? Did that person say, look, I've got some alcohol or some beer. I've got some refreshments. I've got something to eat up there. We'll have a picnic up there. I'll meet you up there later this afternoon. And that's why they were so determined to even leave the children behind to get up into the sandhills. This is what the police tried to sift through all their information.
We know that the girls were at the beach on New Year's Day and they did meet a boy or some boys.
Yeah.
But was that ever linked to any of this?
Absolutely. It was all investigated. I actually spoke to one of the boys that they actually met on that day, and he said it was just all so innocent. We met, we talked, we said we'd meet up again. Maybe they were keen to go back, hoping that the boys would be there again. These were very innocent times. The other thing that the girls did not know, and something that wasn't widely known at the time, was that the Sandhills was actually quite an area, a bit of a beat for sexual perverts. It was a beat for homosexual people to meet up as well. Homosexuality was a crime at the time. It was a very discreet area. There were a number of exhibitionists. Kids used to slide down the sand hills on cardboard. There was a lot of things happening in that hills area that they weren't aware of. So maybe it was just the perfect storm that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. But who was that person? When Wolfgang gave that description of the surfer boy, I suppose most people had the idea of, okay, it's a bronzed Aussie with the zinc cream on the nose and, buff and whatever. But I actually read the case files, and he actually says 2 very, very interesting things. The first thing is he calls the boy a fat boy. So he wasn't a good-looking, muscly surfer dude. He was a chubby, round-faced boy. Then the other thing that he said that's often been misconstrued, he said that the boy wasn't shaving. So they thought, oh, it must be a young boy, it must be like a 14-year-old boy. He actually meant the opposite. The boy had a chinny beard. And so that makes the boy older, because he said, oh, he's like my brother Helmut, about that age. And his brother Helmut was 17, but this boy could have been 18, 19, 20.
When you're 8, age is a strange concept.
Absolutely. So this was significant when a suspect comes up years later. But the original, I suppose, suspect was misdescribed in the media, and I think that set the investigation back a number of years.
The surfy boy, or the fat boy, as he was referred to, he wasn't the only witness. You had the leathery man, the naked man, the horse riders. There were lots of different men who popped up.
There had been a number of, and I spoke to Barry Ezzy, who was the lifeguard on duty, about this. There were a number of beach pests on that beach area on that day and in the days leading up to it. And it doesn't fill you with a lot of faith about the times, but these beach pests would harass women and ask them for success and try and crack onto them and just make pests of themselves. One of the known beach pests was called the Fat Man. And the Fat Man had a round face, balding head, was a little bit on the chubby side, wore grey pants without a T-shirt, and used to sidle up to women and harass them, ask them personal details, and had been shooed off Wanda Beach a number of times. And I wondered when I was reading about this, was the fat boy and the fat man the same person?
Yeah.
And a lot of these identicates were published in the papers, you know, we're looking for this man. There were other people as well. There was the leathery man, as you said, the older man, a man who liked to walk naked through the hills, you know, an exhibitionist, nudist beaches were coming in at that time. It was the 60s and people were getting into that hippie vibe, I imagine, or bohemian vibe. But this fat boy and fat man sort of stuck with me for quite a time. And I think it was to become quite significant in the years that passed. But at that time, he was an unknown offender. They didn't know who he was, and they didn't have the cross-linking of information for any known sex offender to pop up in their investigation. That was the whole, I suppose, undermining of the investigation.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Bath. I'm speaking with award-winning author Alan J Whiticker about the Wanda Beach murders. By the end of January, the police were no closer. They didn't have really any major leads, and they posted a reward for information. What happened from there? Did that do anything? Did that help?
No, all it did was really encourage people to make erroneous claims and erroneous suspects. They actually went back to both the girls' schools and interviewed all their peers. They were also very, very tough on the family, on the Schmidt family. You know, when you look at a murder investigation, you actually start from the family and work out. So they really wanted to know what the other boys were doing. They wanted to know, did the other boys have friends who knew they were going to the beach? They were really hard on them, and you know, reading between the lines and reading a couple of the statements from the boys back then when they were 16-year-old, I think they were really taken aback by the strength of the police investigation. But there was a lot of political pressure at the time to get this solved. You know, church groups, community groups, they were crying out for it to be solved. And the fact that it wasn't solved was a real, I think, sore on the New South Wales police. You know, a lot of those detectives carry that throughout their whole careers, that they couldn't solve it. There was no misinvestigation or there was no incompetence. You couldn't say that. It was just the wealth of information. You know, I only went through 12 volumes, but there's hundreds of volumes, you know, tens of thousands of typed sheets that they had to go through. It just sunk the investigation.
As is often the case with a case like this, when other murders happen, they're often linked to what happened if there's, you know, some kind of similarity. And the similarity I want to focus on is in June the following year, a woman named Carolyn is murdered in Wollongong. And that particular case kind of is very strongly linked. Can you take us through that?
Yes, the body of a young girl was found on the side of the road down in Mount Ousley, down on the south coast. And a young man, certainly no master criminal, was quickly identified. He was a person called Alan Bassett. He was diagnosed with personality disorder. And I think the police, because of the viciousness of that crime, started to look very closely at Bassett. Where was he on the day that the Wanda Beach murders happened? He said he was at work. There was no evidence of that. Were there similarities between the murder of this young woman and the Wanda Beach murders? Only in age. There were other dissimilarities. He was quickly found not guilty on the basis of his mental illness, and he was hospitalised in Newcastle. But he was a very clever offender in that he was able to, I suppose, taunt the police by saying that he knew more about this than he actually did. And he later became something of a prison artist of some note, and he took great delight in painting paintings of beach scenes and hiding little clues and sending them to the police, believing that he knew more. And one of the leading detectives at that time, a fellow called Seth Johnson, firmly believed that Bassett was involved in the Wanda Beach murders. And again, this derailed the investigation and made, I suppose, the investigation go down a very narrow pathway for a good 10 years. And by that time, I was a young school teacher in the 80s, and Bassett's name was coming up. And I thought, well, what is this connection? This is now 20 years. Is this man who's been in jail for 15 years, the Wanda Beach murders? His name was synonymous with the case for many, many decades.
Do you think he is?
Well, as it turned out, he was released from prison in 2000, and he immediately offered to provide a DNA sample. Because remember, there was a sperm sample. So you would think a sperm sample, DNA. DNA came in to investigations in the late 80s. Why hadn't this been solved? Unfortunately, I found out during the course of writing the book that the police had misled and misplaced the sperm sample. Unfortunately, well-meaning detectives came into the case, wanted to solve the case. They took the sperm sample, tried to get something found out about the sample. The only thing they could really find out about the sperm sample was blood type. And there was no DNA in the 70s, and the sperm sample went missing. Police asked me not to put that in the book because they were embarrassed about it, and I felt I owed them an obligation not to be critical of them. So I wrote to the forensic DNA people in charge and asked them to go on the record and say, what is the status of that sperm sample? And I put in the book that they could not verify it. So it was left up to the imagination of the reader. But it's well known now that the sperm sample was lost. There's a partial DNA profile that has been lifted over the years, a partial male DNA from one of the girls' shorts, but we're waiting, and we've been waiting 20 years now, for DNA technology to catch up and to try and piece that DNA together. But Bassett was quickly ruled out by the detectives that I spoke to in 2002 as a serious person of interest because he had provided his DNA sample. And what he had said had not really married up. He had professed his innocence to get out of jail. He was no longer under the confines of his psychosis. So they quickly ruled him out, which is a shame in many ways because I felt bad for Seth Johnson and many of the police who had chased him and the fact that he had tagged them along for so long. But then opened up the investigation to look at some other suspects. Because of the violence of that crime, a couple of really well-known suspects actually came into view about the time that I was writing the book, which was very fortuitous.
I assume you're talking about mass murderer Christopher Wilder
Yeah.
and then murderer and pedophile Derek Percy. So they were two men that the police turned their attention to.
Well, when I spoke to a couple of the detectives, I said, well, who do you think did it? And I found out that Victorian detectives, of all people, were looking into Derek Percy. I'd never heard of Derek Percy. I didn't know who he was. And they said, well, not only were they looking at him for Wanda, but they were looking at him for the Beaumont children disappearance in Adelaide, the death of a little boy in Glebe, the death of a little boy in Canberra. And this was a multi-agency investigation. And I was absolutely amazed, how can one person be involved in so many crimes? And I actually wrote a book about Percy. I first of all spent 5 years looking at the Beaumont case, but I then spent the next 5 years delving into Percy and seeing where was he involved. And he was a naval rating, and he actually travelled around Australia with the Navy. He wasn't involved in the Canberra murder or the Beaumont children disappearance. They were just very tenuous links. But police seriously looked at his involvement in the Wanda Beach murders. And when I asked them, I actually interviewed Victorian police, they said that his grandmother lived in West Ryde near the girls, and they believed that he was there during that period on school holidays, even though he lived in country Victoria. Now, that was a long bow. And the more I found out about Percy, I interviewed his schoolmates, many of the people who knew him. He was petrified of girls. He was a pedophile. He was a coward. He targeted young children. So I didn't think that he would have the get up and go to approach two girls and say, let's have a picnic in the hills or meet me up in the hills later. Nor was he a violent offender. He had a particular array of dealing with his victims, which was horrific. But he wasn't a violent person. That's why he preyed on children, because children couldn't fight back. His ability to overpower two girls, one who was running for her life, didn't strike me as being real. And then Sydney police re-interviewed some of the brothers, and they couldn't identify this young, maybe he was the young boy that they'd seen at the beach, but he wasn't the surfy type. He had black hair. He was a very weedy, thin-looking kid. They were seen talking to a boy at Redfern on the train to Redfern. Maybe he was that boy, but none of the girls' friends or school friends knew this kid. And I actually interviewed his brother, and his brother said, look, I can't remember ever spending a school holiday with my grandmother in Denniston, which is right next to West Ryde. So that quickly fell apart. And I actually was quite frustrated. And I said to one of the serving police detectives in about 2008, well, who do you believe? And they said, look at Christopher Wilder. And that name was just really out of the blue. Now, Christopher Wilder is an infamous American serial killer. He murdered at least a dozen young models and young women in America in the early 80s. What in heaven's name would he have to do with the Wanda Beach murders?
Yeah, in Sydney, Australia.
In Sydney, Australia. Well, he was born in Sydney, Australia. His father was an American naval officer. He was born in 1945, which made him 18 or 19 at the time of the Wanda Beach murders. He was a known sex offender. He had been sent to a reform school for children for a group rape on a beach. He had married in the late 60s. His wife called him violent and sadistic, and he had moved to America in the early 70s and made $1 million as a builder. He raced cars. He was a part-time photographer. And Wilder was long dead. Wilder died in 1984 in a police shootout in Massachusetts after killing a dozen women. So in 2008, I asked the police, why are you looking at Wilder now? And what not many people knew, that in 1982, when he returned to Australia to visit his elderly parents, he coaxed two young women off Manly Beach on the pretext of taking photographs of them. And this is how he later had his victims at his mercy in America. He said he was a photographer, beautiful girls, could be models, come to my studio, and he murdered them. Now, he sexually abused these two girls, but didn't kill them. And these two girls escaped, and he was actually up on sex charges at the time that he returned to America and murdered these women. And when I asked the detectives, why are you looking at Wilder now? And they said, well, modus operandi was really strong. His ability to charm young girls on a beach, a multiple abduction, a multiple attack. They were looking very seriously at Wilder. I thought he was a bit of a red herring. I hadn't really looked very clearly at him. And I probably only wrote a couple of pages about his very tenuous link to this murder. But the more I thought about it over the years, and there's been two very good books written about Christopher Wilder and his potential involvement in Wanda. One was by Duncan McNabb, and another was by an English writer called Andrew Byrne. And I've read both those books, and they make very strong cases that Christopher Wilder, round-faced, balding, often seen on a beach, propositioning women for sex, older women for sex, a 19-year-old with a baby face, could have been the fat boy that Wolfgang had seen on the beach the day the girls. And when you think about it, one of the things that one of Christine's school friends said to me, I said to her, had you ever despaired over the years that this person had gotten away with it? And she said something really significant. She said, the thought of this man going home and being a loving husband and a loving wife and having a completely normal life for the next 30 years never entered my mind. He would have been consumed by his demons. He would have struck again. He would have been found. And when you look at what happened to Christopher Wilder, how he unravelled in the face of coming back to Australia and standing trial for the rape of these two girls that he had coaxed off Manly Beach, and he'd gone on this murder spree in response to that. His psychological, but also his physical profile fits the Wanda Beach crime. I don't want to say perfectly, but there hasn't been a significant person of interest in the last 30 years that matches what he brings to this crime. Not Percy, certainly not Alan Bassett. Christopher Wilder could very well be the man.
Will we ever get something like that confirmed?
What's hopeful is that this partial DNA profile that the police have from one of the victim's shorts can one day match Christopher Wilder. Now, Christopher Wilder was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea, but he has a brother and a sister living in Australia. There are known DNA profiles, and if technology is able to give us even a hint, and this is where we're finding now in the age of Ancestry.com and people's DNA profiles being loaded up to cyberspace, that one day even a partial match will give us the opportunity to finally solve this crime. Unfortunately, because it's now, almost 60 years. You know, when I wrote the book, it was only like 35 years. But many of the witnesses, many of the people involved in the case, many of the people who invested the case, the mother of the parents have now passed away. There's nobody left, I suppose, to even admit that they know something about it. I think anyone who held on to a family secret has come forward and has been proven not to be involved. The best hope for this case is that DNA profile, and it's in the hands of the police.
Christine and Marianne, do we know whatever came of their loved ones? They've never gotten answers. They've never been able to properly get peace.
After writing the book, I had a couple of mixed experiences with it. You know, many people were thankful that someone had brought the case back out into the open. But I learned very quickly that not everyone involved in this case takes comfort from this being regurgitated. I got a very succinct letter from the Schmidt family saying I had no right to write this, and I had to correspond with them saying, look, I did this in good faith, hoping to bring this out back in the open. They were very traumatised by it. They felt they were handled very poorly by the police. They were fairly quickly discarded by the media. They actually had to change their name. Many of the boys had troubled lives at school, got into drugs, got into trouble. They found it very difficult. You know, it pretty much destroyed the mother. On the other side, with Christine Schmidt, you know, funnily enough, I was able to interview one of her best friends from high school who was actually supposed to go with the girls to the beach that day, but her parents wouldn't let her. And she gave me a fantastic interview, a lovely lady. She actually got a very stern email from the family of Christine Schmidt saying, how dare you talk to this author? So their hurt is very palpable.
Yeah.
And I understand that as a writer. I understand that these are very uncomfortable things that we talk about. But I did write at the end of the book that, you know, these were girls who had hopes and dreams, they had friends. You know, I spoke to many of the friends 35 years later who were still hurting from these murders. And, you know, they deserve to be solved. You know, we deserve to have answers. Society has to learn from these things. How do these things happen? Why do these things happen? And so, you know, I take some small comfort in that here we are now, almost 60 years later, still talking about this case because it resonates with us that these kids didn't die in vain, that they are remembered, they are loved, and that one day the killer, whether he's dead or alive, will be unmasked and the whole thing will be resolved. And I think a lot of people would be thankful for that when it does happen.
Thanks to Alan for assisting us to tell this story. If you'd like to know more about Alan's book, Wanda, The Untold Story of the Wanda Beach Murders, you can find a link for it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Rhiannon Mooney. The executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you've enjoyed this episode, let us know by leaving a rating or review in your favourite podcast app. It helps other true crime fans find our content and helps us keep making the episodes you get to enjoy every week. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation.